Well, it is a joy to be here among you. And as for the basketball thing, yeah, if my team had been destroyed 42-3 in the Big Ten championship game last December, I would be looking for a little revenge too. So Michigan may have a chance here, but to tell a story that may put you on my side a little bit more than that. I remember very clearly being in college at Michigan, attending the Unitarian Universalist Church of Ann Arbor, which was my home congregation, and having this crazy notion in my head that I should become a Unitarian minister or think about becoming a Unitarian Universalist minister. So I made an appointment to talk to the new assistant minister in the Ann Arbor congregation, and spoke with her, and she told me about the process, and we sort of had a semi-regular time to come and talk where she would help me in my discernment. And eventually I spoke to the senior minister too, but I mostly kept to the associate minister, Eva Hokrath, who you may know better by her name, Eva Cameron, minister here for many, many years. And a joy to know her as a colleague when I was in Omaha, and she served this congregation. So it's a pleasure to be in the pulpit, or the former pulpit, of one of my mentors. One of the clear memories I have of growing up in the 1980s is of the Valley Girl fad. I realize that's probably a revelation that dates me. For those too young or too old to remember it, the Valley Girl talk, which I will not replicate for you, featured various colloquialisms such as rad or gnarly or oh my God. And growing up in a small town in Michigan, I never was quite sure which valley this all came from. But I remember many of my female classmates and even some of my male classmates imitating this form of speech. Now, of course, by today's standards, it doesn't take Betty Friedan to tell you that this was a deeply sexist cultural stereotype of women in California. But back in the 80s, we didn't really know about that stuff and just kind of rolled with it. One of the lasting linguistic legacies of that fad was the use, and I will argue this morning, the overuse of the word awesome. Today, awesome is an adjective for nearly everything, from sneakers to what you had for lunch. We use the word awesome to describe the most mundane and ordinary objects, when in point of fact, the word is intended to mean the very opposite. And at the risk of sounding like an old man, my beard does that for me, who shoos away the pesky kids on his lawn, the word awesome means literally something that has inspired awe. That's not to say that such an object was good or excellent necessarily, but merely that it has an aura of unbelievability about it. It is literally incredible, not to be believed. Something has inspired awe within you, has sort of blown your mind. You can't place it in any of your mental categories of your worldview. And that's not always a pleasant experience, nor a particularly complimentary thing to say about someone or something. Quite rarely is it, in fact. Awe, in this literal sense of the word, is the response we have when we are in the presence of the holy. Something is holy when it is totally other or different from our mundane experiences. That is a part of what it means, at least. Awe is a feeling or an emotion we experience in the presence of something larger than ourselves, that encompasses more than just us. The renowned scholar Rudolf Otto wrote a classic in the field of religious studies entitled The Idea of the Holy. And in it, he tried to put a name to this feeling of experiencing the holy other, holy with a W. Otto described that the holy, using Latin, as you do back in his time, he says it is the mysterium tremendum et fascinans, a tremendous, fascinating mystery. So taking my cue from Rudolf Otto, I thought we would unpack, if you will, his three ideas about the holy, that it is mysterious, tremendous, and fascinating. Mysterious. Well, there's an old joke that notes that all theologians believe God is ineffable, and yet they go on effing. I didn't promise it was a good joke, just an old joke. One of my teachers and mentors, Roy Rappaport, used to say that the holy is a mystery, properly so called. Meaning that when we say the holy is a mystery, we don't mean it's a mystery like a mystery novel or an episode of Murder, She Wrote. You know, in those cases, there's a detective like Jessica Fletcher who follows clues to uncover the unknown murderer or criminal. And in the case of Murder, She Wrote, she's always successful. Theologians are not detectives following the clues to find God. God, which is one of the many names that can be given to the holy, is unknowable. It's impossible to know the mystery, which is another way of saying that religion is a combination of the rational and the non-rational. Otto called that non-rational experience of the religion the numinous. And the numinous are things that we experience, or experiences that we have that we can't fully explain or really make any sense of. It's because you feel the numinous more than you think it. Sure, sometimes, maybe more than sometimes, religious folks have resorted to supernatural explanations to make sense of those feelings of the numinous. However, that's not inevitably the case. I remember one day in my youth, it was the middle of winter, and I'd caught the flu or some such thing. At any rate, I was sick enough that I convinced my parents that I really did need to stay home from school. And coincidentally, it happened to be the day that the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded on takeoff. That killed everybody on board, including Christine McAuliffe, a teacher who was going to do lessons in outer space. And again, dating myself, these were the days when there were only about 4 or 5 channels on television. And I'm sure my parents didn't even have a VCR back then. So there was literally nothing else to watch on TV but a replay over and over of this explosion. I couldn't believe it had happened. The pundits on TV couldn't believe that it had happened. I would not see anything like it again until the September 11th attacks many years later. But that emotion, that feeling of, I know what I'm seeing, but I can't really process what I'm seeing, is awe. We overuse the word awesome. Rarely, if ever, have tennis shoes ever invoked that feeling in me. But at the same time, it isn't a fully rational experience, is it? In fact, there's a disconnect between what I'm seeing and what I know to be the case. At one level, we know that at some point we'll be able to wrap our heads around the space shuttle blowing up, but at the time, it didn't seem so. How much more awe-inspiring, dare I say awesome, would it be to encounter the holy? Indeed, our Unitarian Universalist ancestors had this very debate about the rational and the non-rational elements of religion. The Unitarians, who broke away from their Calvinist brothers and sisters, did so based on reason. Calvinism, despite being a rather tightly formulated and internally consistent theological system, was not what you would call rational in the purest sense. Reason led to heresy, the Calvinists claimed, and heretics were to be excommunicated and possibly burned. The early Unitarians, like Channing, argued that God made us to reason and therefore expects us to use our rational minds. Ironically, it would take one generation before that stance was challenged. Folks like Emerson and Parker and Thoreau were disillusioned with a religion that sought to mostly be rational. Corpse cold was the term Emerson used to describe such a church. The Transcendentalists were romantics in the truest sense of the term. They found the holy not in these well-reasoned syllogisms, but in nature, in poetry, in love. They yearned for an experience of something real. They wanted to feel the numinous. And if it meant living in a cabin in the shores of Walden Pond to feel it, then that was what they were going to go do. Now, in addition to being mysterious, the holy is also tremendous. That is to say, it's powerful and scary. There's tons of examples of God's power in the Bible. Every time I think of the power of that Old Testament God, I can't help but think of the ending of Raiders of the Lost Ark, where the Nazis are destroyed by God's wrath. And it's a powerful image that somehow could never be matched by any of my Sunday school stories growing up. But Steven Spielberg aside for the moment, the Bible underlines that God's power is something to be afraid of. Perhaps that's nowhere clearer than in the book of Job. The very first verse, there once was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. And there follows a debate between God and Satan over just how much does Job fear God. And a little like that movie Trading Places with Eddie Murphy and Dan Aykroyd, God and Satan have a gentleman's agreement to destroy Job's life just to see if he finally will curse God. Now, it's a long book, one of the longest of the Old Testament, actually. But there's a little key section I want to read to you where Job recounts the power of God. This is Job 26, verses 7 through 14. He stretches out to the north over the void and hangs the earth upon nothing. He binds up the waters in his thick clouds, and the cloud is not torn open by them. He covers the face of the full moon and spreads over it his cloud. He has described a circle on the face of the waters at the boundary between light and darkness. The pillars of heaven tremble and are astounded at his rebuke. By his power he has stilled the sea. By his understanding he struck down Rahab. By his wind the heavens were made fair. His hand pierced the fleeing serpent. These are indeed but the outskirts of his ways, and how small a whisper do we hear of him? But the thunder of his power, who can understand? That's quite an impressive resume. No wonder God points out how much Job fears him. Job, at least at this point in the story, has a pretty clear understanding of all the things God can do. Later on, God comes in the whirlwind to remind Job of all the things God has done and can do. And indeed, those words to Job in the whirlwind are the last words God ever speaks directly to anyone in the Old Testament. They're about God's majesty and why you should be afraid. Now, that's one example of this tremendous power of the holy. But remember, I said that God is not the only way to understand the holy. So I was thinking of non-theistic ways to experience the power and the fear of the holy without resorting to God or some other form of theism. Believe it or not, this was actually very important to Rudolf Otto. He lived at a time when people were just beginning to understand Eastern traditions like Buddhism and Hinduism, and some of those texts were being translated into European languages. He felt his analysis of the holy applied to all religions and was known for traveling extensively in Asia to study Eastern faiths. So when he says the holy, he doesn't necessarily mean the Western notion of God. There's a great episode of The Simpsons in which there's a Christian rock singer who befriends Homer. And at the end of the episode, she says that she and her band are going to cross over from Christian rock and go mainstream. And Homer asks, well, won't that be hard? And she says, oh, no, all we have to do is change all of the times we say Jesus and replace it with the word baby. I sympathize with this approach sometimes. What if we replaced God with the word love? Love would be a powerful experience of the holy. Huey Lewis the News famously sang, it don't take money, it don't take fame, it don't take no credit card to ride this train. Tougher than diamonds and stronger than steel, you won't feel nothing until you feel the power. Feel the power of love. To fall in love And I mean fall hard in love. This is an experience of the holy. It's non-rational, that's for sure. That's part of what Otto means by the numinous. You don't have control over who you fall in love with, nor do they. That's a scary thing because you're making yourself super vulnerable when you try to connect to another person at that deep level. So scary, in fact, that some of those who have been burned by the power of love don't seek it anymore. But that's a great tragedy, to cut oneself off from such a tremendous mystery as the holy. Fortunately, the holy is also fascinating. Despite its mystery, despite its power, despite even the fear and awe we may experience in its presence, we are fascinated by it. It has an allure. We're drawn like a moth to the proverbial flame. We want to know, what is it like? We want to have an experience of that holy. In our reading this morning, Brad Warner recounts his experience of encountering the holy as he was walking to work along the streets of Tokyo. He's something of a Buddhist rebel, as I mentioned. He likes to call stories like the one we heard in our reading today enlightenment porn, experiences that are meant to tantalize and excite. But he says you can't chase after someone else's experience. You have to go have your own. Before I left Chicago after graduating from Meadville Lombard, a friend of mine gave me tickets to see Sting and Tracy Chapman at the United Center. Kind of a combination birthday graduation present. Probably one of the best concerts I've ever been to. And United Center is where the Chicago Bulls play basketball, and the arena was packed. There's something about rock and roll, isn't it? The music isn't particularly deep. It's not complex like Mozart or Wagner. The guitar riffs aren't nearly as elaborate as Buddy Guy or B.B. King. A couple of years back, there was a comedy routine that a band in Australia did where they pointed out that there are dozens, if not hundreds, of pop songs, hits throughout the decades, which are the same four chords repeated in the same order with different rhythm and speed. But that energy, the bass line, the hook that rock and roll brings grabs people at a primitive level and gives them that experience of the numinous. People have been attracted to it for generations, and conservative Christians have feared it for that long, perhaps with good reason. Rock and roll is the fascinating element of the numinous. Rudolf Otto teaches that there is a mystery to life that we cannot know, yet gives us energy and passion to live. We feel the hunger for it, even as we are scared and maybe repulsed by it. For Unitarian Universalists, I think we need to acknowledge the holy without necessarily falling into the easy assumption of theism or flatten it out so much that we think that a new sweater is awesome. Lots of things can be holy. Lots of things can be the gateway to the holy, just walking across the bridge for one. But most of all, I think it's important to be open to the transformative power of the holy, to risk being transformed by its power, even if it is scary at times. Life can be scary, even while it is worth living to the fullest. And like our fellow iconoclast Brad Warner, we need to be skeptical of it. We must not fully abandon reason lest we be overwhelmed or coerced in dangerous ways. Yes, I've probably dated myself this morning. If you happen to get a chance to rewatch this sermon in whatever way you do, whether it's on YouTube or something like that, I suggest counting the number of references to the 1980s that I have made in the past 17 minutes. So while I may be old in the eyes of some, at least some of our youth, I hope never to cease to search and perhaps find a window to the holy. May we all have an open heart to the numinous that shines forth throughout our lives. I love you. Thank you for having me. You're all awesome. Amen.